All right. Hi, everyone. I will try to stay focused in this talk, although it's quite hard when there are no human faces in front of you. But one way or another, what we're going to talk about today is smart mobility governance as a key concept in itself. I'm in my training, I'm an engineer, and I'm in the School of Engineering. However, I hope you will be able to understand some of the words that I'm going to say today, because they're going to draw from many different disciplines beyond engineering, because at the end of the day, we're dealing with the socio-technical system, which is transport. So, and the socio comes first for a reason. So yeah, the topic is smart mobility governance, and I think we'll have a very simple way to try to unpack it. We'll talk about what is smart mobility and then what is governance. And I think joining those two together, we should be able to map the answer to that bigger question. So hopefully there will also be some, I will try to keep as a good transport engineer, I will try to keep my schedule so we have enough time for discussion at the very end. This picture here is from Helsinki and is deliberately chosen there. I have deliberately avoided putting any kind of, because when you do a Google search and you type in smart mobility, you know what you get. You get a lot of these like digital data flow images. For me, this is a very smart mobility system. People walking, cycling, public transport, all very functional, high quality, and so on. So I like to say that in many ways I come from the future. This future is city of Helsinki. It's not all fine and dandy, but it's quite good in many ways. But we can of course also talk about what are the challenges in any case, with or without the various kinds of digital and other layers in this image. So yeah, let's start with this first part of what is smart mobility. I'm gonna try something a bit more interactive. So I hope you know what Menti is. If you don't, it should be a fairly straightforward task. So if you take your phone, you should be able to scan the QR code at the corner of this slide, and you should be able to answer your own idea on what is smart mobility. One or two words that first come to your mind. You can of course, great, someone is already answering. You can submit multiple answers as well. So let's take a minute or two for you to throw in what do you think about this. Already good amount of topics: sustainable, accessible, functional, adaptive. Looks like the sort of broader functional requirements, and then there is this flexible, I guess it's also there, maybe somewhat closely related to this adaptive, and then there's this digital AI, data-driven technology aid. Yeah, quite an interesting set of answers. Definitely, thank you for that. So it unpacks a little bit on what we'll have to talk about today. So technology, we'll have to understand that. So smart mobility is a form of technology. So we'll have to see what does that exactly mean. To what end? Sustainability has a sort of an ultimate end. This sort of strong sustainability, of course. And then these sort of sub goals of accessibility, functionality, adaptiveness, flexibility. They will definitely be on our mind when we come back to talk about governance itself. So I'm not saying this is all there is to smart mobility, but that's where I started delving into this bigger concept. So I started working on so-called self-driving vehicles some 15 years ago. Of course, a vehicle with some kind of sensing, communication, processing technology that is trying to remove the driving task. I also like this quote, the point number 3. So it's not just about these kinds of technical points of convergence or just the driving task, but in many ways it's a large-scale deployment of robots in a society at large. So I think if you sort of think about this as just the first level, you're somewhere there as a like electrical machine engineer or maybe mechanical engineer, then removal of the driving task would be sort of a narrow perspective on what mobility or transport is in this sense of technology. But then if you frame it as a large-scale deployment of robots, I think the challenge or the problem becomes a bit different. Yeah. So that's one example on which I have worked. Another example is mobility as a service. That's where people start to say, but that's a service, it's not technology. Well, it is technology. Yeah. So basically, technology is anything that is human made. Yeah. So we are not going to get into the semantics of this is a service and this is a tech thing. Basically, this is all technology because kind of humans are making it. It's not naturally found in the environment. Of course, it's some level of kind of integration there, a question of different levels of services and information, transaction, booking, and so on. That's the kind of fundamental idea. It basically draws from the telecom industry as well. Yeah, that you would be able to buy these sort of packages of bundles and so on. But at the same time, that's its biggest advantage, but it's also biggest disadvantage as well. Just an example. And then this is also some form of, so we have, of course, also these kinds of vehicles. These are pictures taken in Helsinki a couple of years ago. They're all electric. They just have different number of wheels and sizes of wheels and riding posture and skill set that comes with it. So definitely a lot of these emerging vehicles are part of the. This is again just something that I have worked on. So I'm just drawing on my own experiences. I have also worked on different kinds of drones and other sorts of things like that. So working across all these different technologies has sort of brought me to kind of think a bit more in conceptual terms. So you're not going to see a lot of numbers in this presentation. You'll see some graphs, but I think the point will be to push us to think a bit more conceptually. So in a narrow sense, smart mobility as a form of technology is a natural continuation of what we used to call telematics when the computers came out in the 70s. And then after that, at some point, there was a big trend of talking about intelligent transport systems. I have worked as a young student, I have worked with these words. The word smart mobility was not in our vocabulary back in those days. So there is some kind of continuation, there is some path there, yeah. And in many ways, they are a result of various kinds of converging technologies. Yeah, so we talked about the kind of propulsion technology, which is the electric motor, all these kinds of developments in energy storage, batteries, and so on. But then the sensing, communication, automation, digitalization more broadly in society. So various kinds of converging technologies around and in smart mobility are what makes it this kind of technology. Together with this technical side, it also usually means new kinds of business models especially in connection to the kind of platform economy and many advantages and disadvantages that come with that. Yeah. So maybe nowadays have news articles in Helsinki where Volt, as one of the companies that you might know about. So they have, of course, given a set amount of accounts for the delivery workers, and eventually they have stopped issuing new accounts. So that has led to this phenomenon that those already having accounts are then renting out accounts to their own accounts to other people as sort of a pyramid scheme in some way, so that those renting out end up eventually having to work for those who originally had accounts, and then when they account for that renting plus their own costs, they end up working for sort of really under minimum wage type of, like, couple of hours, couple of euros per hour type of salary. So just another example of some of these kind of negative aspects of the platform economy. So the literature that we have in our field has already kind of tried to expand or kind of question the underlying view on smart mobility as sort of positive thing in itself. I mean, especially in engineering, there is a default bias, a positive bias towards technology. So these are the sort of two fundamental arguments that we can already see in the literature. So one side is this sort of technocentric approach to the supply in the transport system, and on the kind of demand side, it's converting people into sort of passive consumers uh, without sort of treating them as anything else, not let alone as residents or citizens. So that would be sort of something that is already rather known. It has been known for now some 10 plus years. The literature also talks a lot about impacts. So at least in our field, we also have this in transport policy more broadly, or transport governance, if you wish. There is a dominant discourse that always revolves around impacts. Yeah, socio-environmental impacts are, of course, the crux of our field. So it makes all the sense to talk about them. And in many ways, studies are showing that, of course, impacts from smart mobility are not necessarily positive in aggregate terms. If you think about, let's say, climate targets, carbon emissions, and that kind of stuff. And they're also not necessarily positive in kind of dissipative impacts. If you think about kind of how do the impacts affect different types of people in a city. Of course, the literature has also recognized that smart mobility is still sort of emerging. It's fundamentally uncertain technology of what will it be or become. So that inevitably also means this sort of uncertainty of impacts that come with it. And there is some recognition that there is this kind of pushing of technology by specific interests, let's say. Yeah. So we can talk about that a bit more, but let's say that it has been recognized to some extent already in the literature. What I think our field is kind of lacking is a desire to learn from so many other fields that are dealing with this concept of technology. So on my meanderings through different kinds of research fields or fields of knowledge more broadly, if you wish, I have discovered that there is a field of that's called technology studies. Believe it or not, there are sort of people who study technology more broadly. Some even call it technology management. They are, of course, somewhat connected to the industrial engineering departments, but sometimes they're in sociology departments. Sometimes they're in philosophy departments. It depends, yeah. So people have been studying technology in various ways, in various multidisciplinary ways, yeah. So when we talk about smart mobility, we have to recognize that this is what I like to call when I think about it, emerging technology. So it means it's not a stabilized, finally formed. So it's a little bit like what has been already recognized, that this is still kind of developing technology. But if you talk about it as emerging, it means it also talks about sort of these kinds of things. So radical novelty, fast growth, ambiguity, and so on. But it also means it hasn't been completely embedded in society. It also means that we are going to change society as technology is going to become embedded in it. Yeah, that's one of the big lessons we have from technology studies. Like, the world that we have today is not the world from the 70s plus a computer. It's a completely different world. So it's not this additive, but rather ecological change that happens when you introduce technology. The second point there is that we oftentimes assume this sort of linear technological trajectory. In fact, it's rarely like that. Even if you look at history of transport technologies, like there are these famous studies of how bicycles used to look like in the beginning and how they end up now and how they look even nowadays. They're always changing. So there is very much a nonlinear path. And then the third very important point we have to learn from these more broadly social sciences of technology is that on the one hand, it's value laden. It means there are values built into technology. Those values can be values like speed or profit making or various kinds of things like that. That's one side of the story, and the other side is that it's socially constructed. It means that sort of groups of people end up defining, especially critical groups of people end up defining what technology is. Yeah. So we oftentimes have this narrative that sort of humanity creates technology, but in fact, it's not necessarily like that. Yeah. So like neither you or me have really had um, many things to do with the creation of the smartphone. Yeah. It's at the end of the day, it's a device that has been created by. You can kind of at the end of the day narrow it down to a rather limited number of humans out of 7 billion. Yeah. But then the technology ends up impacting the 7 billion currently, or 8 soon, I guess, currently living humans on planet Earth. So if I go back to this notion of trajectory, of technology having trajectory, these are sort of kind of the long-term waves are a classical conceptualization, even from the first studies, these kind of technological studies. So these are sort of changes of how one technology changes to the other. In our domain would be sort of horses being replaced by cars. So this long wave takes a couple of decades. Kind of like the land use changes temporality that is there in the cities. Yeah. And then this graph on the right side is the one that talks about demand responsive transport services that have been sort of in different phases, but then many have been sort of failing and some have been surviving for a while. And we kind of know that this technology is still sort of not very much omnipresent in so many places. It's still a niche technology. So it's been emerging now for several decades because it's not being properly embedded, mostly because we're sort of deploying demand responsive transport without making any radical changes to the transport regime, especially the sort of the car side of the whole story with like parking restrictions and charges of various kinds and so on. Then we're surprised why DRT is not working in so many urban settings. For rural settings, of course, a different context. So if you think about technology in time, if you think about it as a process, you can also think about it changing so that you can have the trajectory that the technology has, meaning it varies over time in its form, but with it comes the impacts or the performance more broadly, if you wish. So of course, we would ideally want over time our smart mobility technology to get us to some better world, better performance, better world of impacts. And this will be this sort of stage 2 or stage 3 even in this graph of the impacts or performance. But then what we usually forget is that this transition is not necessarily on this path X, which is we're just going to get, as time moves onward, we're just going to get better and better impacts. In fact, in so many cases, things have to get worse before they get better. And then that's this red path C, yeah. So, and that's of course if we are not properly managing our technology. Yeah. So nowadays, again, Finland has pretty much realized that the use of smartphones for children under age 13, 14 should completely be forbidden. Yeah, because it's simply not a technology that works for such young human brain. Yeah, so but now we are sort of recovering from that, but we already lost a generation or two from overuse and exposure to these digital devices that looked so promising and shiny at the very beginning. Yeah. So I guess we're still learning as humanity how to deal with our technology. So to me, this is of course also that. So this question of pretty much uncertain impacts of technology, which in that sense will be these two curves, the turquoise green one and the blue one. So the very beginning of technological trajectory, you are mostly uncertain about its impacts. So you have sort of low knowledge of impacts, but at the same time you have high technological flexibility, meaning you can change the pathway of technology. So we could argue that in the early stages of the 20th century, we did not really know the impacts that cars as a form of technology will have on our cities. We had probably quite a lot of flexibility to make them or not to make them in different ways. But back then we didn't have the knowledge. Now we have the same situation. We're sort of dealing with self-driving vehicles, and we're kind of like pretending, oh, what is going to happen? We don't know. Well, we kind of know. We kind of know a lot more than we knew in the 20th century. Yeah, we have 100 years of experience of what sort of dominance of cars does to cities, and a city dominated by car is simply not something that makes sense by any indicator of sort of human scale. So that's what I would say is maybe this learning gap that we still have to fill in our sense. But then what I'm trying to say here, if you as a kind of a big picture, is that of course technology is not just sort of a rational technical phenomenon, and especially if you try to look at it as a process in terms of time, it should help in kind of deepening its understanding, and of course also its later on governance. So speaking of governance, let's deal with that side of the story. So let's do the same exercise as you just did, the one with smart mobility. So what's your take on what is governance? So you should be able to scan this QR code and add your thoughts there. Okay, yeah, looks good. So I think you touched upon very good points for sure. So what the literature would mostly agree with you is this perspective on governance as structure. Yeah, governance as structure for decision making, or better say, it's kind of a rule set or set of rules that different stakeholders work with to make decisions. That would be sort of a very classical definition of governance, and that would be, of course, laws, contracts, even to the level of like meeting rules and so on. And there, of course, are different kinds of power relations as well. That's what the literature definitely recognizes. So governance is structure, yeah, for decision making. However, governance can also be seen as a process, a little bit like the technology in itself. So in a sense, the word itself comes from this sort of point of steering, piloting a ship, which is sort of leads to this idea of this being a process of steering society through collective actions. So there is some need to kind of have organized actions, and then those actions should lead to some kind of public good, yeah, common goals. More broadly, but usually the common goals are some form of public good. And that happens, of course, through different kinds of networks of governance actors, or what we usually shortly put the many hands problem. Yeah. So it's kind of the double-edged sword of humanity. We are a social species, and we do things in groups, and that's our power. That's how we have evolved, and we have sort of substantial power present in this world due to that. But at the same time, that's our biggest disadvantage as well. Yeah, the fact that you have to coordinate people with so many things. You have to coordinate actions with so many different people. So I'm somewhere there that between both of these. So to me, governance is structure, but it's also a process, and I think it helps to think about it in that way. Yeah. And then when we talk about governance of smart mobility, we know from existing studies that oftentimes these long-term goals are not clear, not properly established, or not prioritized in a proper way. It oftentimes leads to some kind of short-term goals of just like, let's just test things out and see what happens, and so on. A little bit of like the Silicon Valley mentality. And oftentimes the actions used to steer smart mobility is mostly limited to these sorts of traditional policies, like regulation or pricing or taxation and that kind of stuff. So there is very little innovation in governance, meaning new types of policies are thought of, or then there is very little sort of coordination with other sectors responsible for governance. Yeah. So a classical problem happens that you can buy, an electric scooter of certain power and so on freely on the market, because that's regulated by a different ministry than a transport ministry in some countries, and then sort of the problem then appears in the transport sector as crashes or drunk riding and so on. But then eventually sort of the transport sector has no influence over the fact that you can even buy this vehicle in the first place on a sort of free market condition, which in my mind shows already sort of this fundamental. Of course, this is a big fundamental challenge in transport governance, the siloing of the mobility system. But then if we try to sort of expand this even further, we know that if you think about governance as a process where there are different actors, we know, of course, also from research that these actors have different strategies. Yeah, they're not on the same page of why we have smart mobility, why should we have it, or how should we have it, and so on. Yeah. So, especially for the automotive sector, smart mobility has in many ways been a threat. It has been sort of, they have been entering the field to kind of control the disruption or to manage their own power position in the transport system. Some different actors have maybe from the public sector have been trying to minimize negative externalities, like those sort of the case of crashes and so on, while some other actors, maybe more from like the kind of technological companies and so on, are along the lines of like, let's just have this technological experimentation because that's a better way for us to develop technology, or sort of a faster way, sort of run fast and break things. The logic of again Silicon Valley transposed onto the mobility domain. Among all of this of course usually ends up on the city streets, especially when we talk about mobility systems, where then the municipal level actors have to deal with this, global phenomenon of smart mobility. So they have to act usually in a void. So usually there aren't laws or procedures or any kinds of other structures. Oftentimes the ministry level, sort of the national level, is supporting technological experimentation due to these hopes of economic growth and so on, because they also want to sort of have this narrative of being progressive. They are not just sort of blocking bureaucrats that stop innovation and so on, but they're enabling innovation but then that innovation ends up on the city streets where people crash or other sorts of things happen. And then the municipal level actors have to deal with this void, this institutional void problem. And then they are in between conflicts of all kinds of actors, of course. There, the private sector is pushing for certain things, and the residents, the citizens themselves are requesting something else. So this ends up in a lot of conflicting situations. There, of course, many places that are visible in the media, especially, again, if I take Finland as an example, we have active citizens who publish sort of opinion pieces in newspapers, and that's one way of expressing sort of dissatisfaction in the when you have, of course, freedom of press, which is or high level of freedom of press, let's say, which is a good thing to have in a democracy. But then overall, what we know from the literature is there is this neoliberalization of the governance itself, which means the private sector is gaining more and more power to decide on how should smart mobility look like, or how should it be deployed. So this is where we come to a very recent statement from one of the handbooks on transport policy that says exactly these lines. So politics is not a necessary evil or a problematic distortion of scientific reality, but rather an essential aspect to the solution seeking. Yeah? So I know that I, as an engineer, have not been trained in politics, and that exactly has been this idea that politics is this sort of dirty, evil thing that sort of messes with the engineering world. In fact, it's just what it is. It's like gravity. If you pretend there is no gravity, you're probably a very bad engineer. So if you pretend there is no politics involved, or there isn't, or there should not be politics involved, then I think you're equally bad engineer in my mind. Yeah? In that sense. So in this sense, politics means with a kind of politics with a capital P, coming back to these principles that some of you have already very well recognized: legitimacy, accountability, transparency, all the important principles of modern democratic societies, that then also mean inclusiveness and participation. So then imagine actually governance decisions related to smart mobility that are conducted by actually having broad public debate, proper public participation early on, and so on, as opposed to this being in many places left completely unregulated, where sort of technology can be just deployed, or even worse, pushed down onto the citizens by the state actors themselves. Yeah. So both of these are not a very good point to be in. So for me, this is what eventually governance has to be. Transport governance more broadly, smart mobility governance in particular. And that, of course, is a very fundamentally connected to kind of what do we oftentimes, of course, also forget in transport studies, that planning is not just about modeling more of the past, but it's actually about being able to envision different future than the one we have right now, the one that is not very sustainable or not on the path of any kind of long-term sustainability. So if I connect back the whole point of technology having its path, and at some point now we have locked ourselves into these current transport technologies that we are surrounded with, and we just keep on thinking within that box of these are the current technologies, and we just have to sort of make them more efficient and so on. I think we're fundamentally, again, sort of bad engineers, because we're not asking the right questions of what exactly, how should a city look like, or what should a good life in the future look like. And with those kinds of questions, you can really open up this sort of field of futures, as opposed to this narrow, kind of like when you have seen horses having those side barriers so they can keep looking straight and going straight forward. We are kind of doing that quite a lot in transport planning, transport policy more broadly. So I suppose this is the whole point of foresight, or thinking about future, is to be able to radically expand this view and imagine how we can break away from the current unsustainable path. But that in itself, if I just leave it here, this would just be, okay, this is just about imagination and associated actions. We have to accept that this is about conflict. And conflict is not a surprise. It's fundamental feature of democracy. Yeah, you cannot have a democratic society without conflict. Yeah, there is no such place where you have democracy and then everything is sort of peaceful and uniform. That would mean that we're all the same. Then there will be no diversity at all in human nature, which would also mean that, I mean, it doesn't exist. That future doesn't exist without diversity. Yeah? So it's about how do you actually build diversity into the governance process. So how do you get this agonistic, not antagonistic, as kind of conflict that is unproductive, but actually conflict that is productive. Yeah. So that you still have legitimate adversaries arguing for their positions, but then they can end up co-creating decisions. So I think that's where we need a lot more innovation on the one side, and on the other side, we in our field, we have to yes, governance is about rules and about laws, but it's also about people in those networks of governance. And those people are, if we know, of course, about people in mobility studies more broadly, are very deep in reach beings, yeah, that have various kinds of sociological and psychological factors in them. They're not rational automata agents that sort of just make these rational decisions clean with only facts and so on. They have values, they have beliefs, they have assumptions, they have emotions. They affect the governance process itself, yeah? And oftentimes they are unquestioned in many ways. And this is something that feels like organizational studies has already recognized, yeah? So if you want to change an organizational culture, you don't just change how the office looks like or what kind of rules we have for meetings and so on. You have to change the underlying assumptions, sort of how people think. Or the opposite classical examples they had from these studies is that, you know, they change the CEO, they change even some people in key power positions, but then the organization ends up behaving the same way. So that means that something underlying has remained in the collective psyche of that organization. So in my case, I have been then transposing this concept to the concept of governance culture more broadly to, again, kind of unpack these deeper layers. And this is an example from integrated land use and transport planning, but I think it's a very similar, it's sort of equally important field, but similar to transport, to smart mobility governance. I would really want to do this kind of process research. So each one of these graphs is about 2 months of meetings between different kinds of actors. So you have civil servants, landowners, elected officials, consultants, various kinds of public authorities, developers. So each one of these is a different human being, and they are discussing about different things, and that's where, so it's kind of many months process, and you can see how people enter the process, many leave. There are different topics that are being discussed. So this in itself is a very dynamic and a non-linear system. And pretending that it's not is, again, we're you know, if you go back to sort of how we teach planning, is like, you know, collect data, generate plans, and then produce alternatives. Yes, these are the G, D, P phases that you have here, but they're in fact a lot more complex in reality. So only by embracing this complexity is how we can really kind of deepen our understanding of what governance is at the end of the day. So that was pretty much what I had in mind to tell you. I hope at least you have two main takeaways. That sort of technology is not this technical phenomenon only. If it helps you think about it as a process and as a sort of a pathway, as how it evolves, and that should lead you to, and of course the fact that it's socially constructed and so on, but that's part of the governance itself. And then if you think about governance, again, not as of this rational phenomenon that is just about structures and kind of laws and rules, but it's also, again, processual phenomenon. Those two should feel intuitive enough for so many engineers to kind of understand it and unpack further. And to end, I'm a big fan of Donella Meadows and her work on deep leverage points. So at some point, we also wrote a paper with Marco about this. So at the end of the day, we have been trained again to think about these like, upper level on this graph, this number 12, number 11, and so on. What kind of taxes should there be and subsidies and so on? When in fact, the problem is much deeper. So it's in the mindset, it's in the power, it's in the what kind of goals do we have. So I think that should be part of our part of the debate, part of our thinking, if we are here to transform transport system more broadly. So thank you for your attention, and it will be great to have some discussion and questions on your side.